Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we have our econ show where we're going to look at a wide view and a broad view really of different topics and how they are impacting decisions that are being made at the investment level, at the Fed level, at the government level, because there's a lot of moving pieces at this point as we've had some decent new data dumps come out over the last couple of weeks, with the most recent being the PCE data from the US. So in the first segment, we're going to talk about, some of the shifting populations and is that going to kind of change the climate narrative or how we're measuring climate change and some of these important pieces with the movement into cities, out of cities, how are we measuring this? And then we want to look at some of the geopolitical shifts that we've continued to see, not only within just the US government and the US military, but also what's happening in China. And then we're going to wrap up with some of the pieces of debt that are, putting a little bit of extra pressure, especially in the emerging market front. Then in segment 2, we're going to go deeper into Fed rate hikes and wages. And they're continuously at odds with each other, where the Fed rate hikes are trying to push down wages because then it has a second order effect of pushing down inflation. But when does the Fed cut? And wages right now are remaining fairly sticky. So again, how is that going to transpire? Not only with what the Fed is going to do, but also how is the consumer going to react? Then we're going to follow that up with falling real wages and spending. So we've already covered, how the Fed and banks are reacting to what is happening at the wages front. But then, real wages fell again. And as real wages are falling, delinquencies are rising, interest expenses going up. How does that really translate into spending? And then what is going to happen when we start looking at the real estate market? Then we're going to turn to Europe and show on how the data has weakened further, but inflation remains sticky. And that's, again, the counterbalance that we continue to see is, the data is getting worse, but inflation remains really on course for what we expected, where you were going to kind of normalize and then really struggle to continue to fall because there's so much liquidity out there. And we really want to dig into that. Then we're going to wrap up with Chinese growth remaining muted. It's still bumping along. It's still expanding, but not to the level I think people were expecting, as the loan stress, especially at the local government financial vehicles or LGFVs, continue to show stress. So we want to put all that together and look at and give kind of a broad summary of what is happening in the world today. So as we kick off with what is happening and how things are being measured within, the climate change movement, and we've talked about some of the fun that people are having with measurements, with statistics. And it's important to look at some interesting pieces, because if you look at where a lot of the temperature gathering is happening, it's right near airports. And when you consider what that means for surfaces and for temperature, and for anybody who has been in their backyard and then gone onto a highway, you can see that there is a vastly different measurement and just underlying, where is this energy being stored? So I thought these were two interesting charts looking at how concrete and asphalt and urban heat islands add to some of the pain with the heat waves. And for anybody who's maybe in downtown Houston versus further out, you can attest to some of the problems. So when you look at the level of air temperature, and then you look at grass and the surface temperature, you're at 104 degrees, but on asphalt, you're at 149 degrees. Now, as somebody who has worked in Manhattan for most of my career, anybody can tell you that even when you get into fall, those subway stations are like convection ovens. And during these heat waves, it just feels like it's all around you, like you're just cooking in it. So this is also an interesting thing, because as you've seen the movement towards urbanization, the movement towards the cities, you've had a huge buildup of buildings. You've had, what has created some of these underlying shifts where you almost are creating, as they describe, heat islands, where you're retaining all of that and then it dissipates. And if you have heat waves, where a heat wave is when even at night you don't get any reprieve, there's no ability for the asphalt or the concrete to release that heat back into the atmosphere to create that balancing effect. So then you have these core pieces, and one of the key interesting things when you think about urban landscape and urban design is the use of grass on roofs, additional gardening, or some sort of wildlife that will be, I should say, plants that are in these terraces that come off the buildings. And a lot of this is to create more of a absorption, because not only does it obviously provide oxygen, absorb CO2, make it look pretty, but there's also a certain amount of impact. And these are some interesting things that we have to consider when we're addressing what is currently installed. And this was, I think, a really interesting piece when you look at some of the underlying flows of the rural, parks and vegetated areas, which typically have cooler surface temperatures, contribute to cooling the air. Then as you go to suburban, then to commercial, then to downtown. So when you look at how people have shifted over the COVID period, where we had this mass urbanization, now we have a bit more of a sprawling movement out of the cities. Is that going to help address some of these pockets of heat that we've continued to see? And is it going to give us some opportunity to address some of the commercial real estate that will likely have to be repurposed? And can we restructure it in such a way that it would reduce some of these heat points? But it's also important when you think about calculating present versus future, past versus present, because when you look at the numbers that are being used, and it's like, oh, this is the hottest here, this is the hottest there. It's like, well, what are the measurements against? When they say, oh, you're taking out the highs from 1930, it's like, we didn't have airports in 1930. So what are you comparing? Are you comparing an airport or a very, hard, concrete, heavy structure against a more rural backstop? And again, that's where we always want to say that you have to look at all the data and make sure, and we're not saying that weather patterns aren't shifting. We're not saying that it is getting warmer if you just look at the underlying curve. It's just, what is the aggregate and how bad is it? And we have to be realistic about what that narrative is versus what the actual data is telling us, and some of the ways that you can kind of play. And this is on both sides. You can play it on both sides. I mean, it's statistics. You can, for a perfect example, when you look at the Long Island Railroad went from being on time 78% of the time to 98% of the time because they changed the definition of on time. It wasn't to the platform, it was to the tunnel. And they claim that because Amtrak controlled the tunnel, it wasn't their fault if they couldn't get through it on time. So again, it's just a matter of where do you strike it? How do you strike it? When we have in Florida, we had the most recent hurricane, and they're comparing wind speeds back to where things were in 1890, which we tied I think it was 1890, which we tied. And it's interesting because it's like, well, what wind speed were we using? We're using the ones from the actual eye up in the sky. Or are we using land speeds? So again, these are little, nuances that, and I'm by no means saying that climate change isn't real or false or weather is. I'm just saying, look at the data, ask questions. And these are things that we want to make sure that when we're comparing where we were in the past, it's apples to apples to make sure things are moving in the right direction, and we're focusing on the right problems and not just throwing good money after grift or some other nonsense. And here's one of the key pieces as we see some of these pivots. Working arrangements within the U.S., you have 57.7% that are fully on site, 31.5% that are hybrid, and then 10.7% that are fully remote. And one of the things that we had said is that you were going to kind of bleed back towards probably 60% fully on site. And then you were going to get this a growing demand for or shift towards hybrid. And that's something that is, and we had a chart, I think it was last week, looking at large cities versus smaller cities. And you're seeing that the smaller cities are all back in the office, but those big cities are 50% of normal. And that's something that, again, leads back to what we were talking about, the shift in the use of urbanization, the demand to be in city centers versus being in outside centers. And it was interesting because European and U.S. productivity growth accelerated post-2020 as work from home levels increased. And again, this is going to be very personal data. I am not more efficient at home. That is a personal thing. So I will have to be in an office, but I know a lot of people that end up being more productive at home. And it's interesting because the percentage of days work from home, 33.3% versus 4.8%. And I think it's important when you look at the pivot of where people are, because now this is, again, less cars that are being put on the road Monday to Friday. You're seeing more consumption at home versus in the cities. And this is changing the way that we're using gasoline, we're using diesel, and the way we have to really construct those city centers. And this provides some opportunity to make some of these adjustments. Now, when you look at the U.S. spends more in defense than the next top 10 countries, this is one of the reasons why when President Trump was elected, we had said that there was all this panic. It's like, look, when you break it down, the U.S. is fairly far advanced in regards to spending, in regards to where things are today on a military standpoint. And there's a certain amount of continuity in the officers and the hierarchy of the armed forces. So even though the presidents will change, Congress will flip from Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat, there's a lot of consistency in the armed forces. Now, you can see that the spending has ramped back up. There was this period of pause, but then we started to move into a different type of ramp up because we saw other problems arising, and it's not surprising to see that big pivot really started to increase as we got into 2001, obviously 9/11, and then that continued to go up. We had a little bit of a sideways move as we cut budgets following the great financial crisis, but now we're moving back higher. And the question is there a way to address this? And we've seen some additional sales. We've seen some reusing and dumping of some inventory. Because one of the things, and I had this debate with my aunt and my mother over the weekend, they were like, oh, we're sending Ukraine all of this money. It's like, well, we're not sending money. We're sending some money. I'm not saying we aren't, but a lot of this is the cash value of the inventory we are sending. So if you're sending ammo, guns, tanks, spare parts, that has a value. So when we're saying that we're sending $1 billion, we're not sending $1 billion of cash. We're sending some cash and a nominal value of the equipment. What is it actually on the balance sheet of the military? That is what we are transferring from us to them. It could be equipment that we were never going to use because it's antiquated. It could be excess or surplus. I mean, we've seen a lot of police stations and police officers and different districts that have some fun toys, and a lot of that is our old equipment that came back from Afghanistan that was decommissioned, and that's why you have some of these heavy equipment in some of these different areas. But this is an interesting piece. Now, it's an interesting shift here is the U.S. confidence in the military. And you can see it's come back down to a low point. And the U.S. confidence in the military by political party, independence, it's at its lowest, but still more than half the country, I think, has faith in the confidence of the military. And it's funny because you see some of these videos of, it's like, look how weak we are, look at this. And understand that there's also a certain amount of psyops that the military also kind of lets out. And I'm not saying that there isn't a bigger pivot, there isn't a bigger shift, but if you look at the art of war, there's always a comment of, don't overestimate your opponents, because in the realistic, they could be lying. And you also don't want to walk around and show it's like, oh, look how great we are. And you need a certain amount of bravado and whatnot, but you also want to tailor that and temper that. So you also don't want to oversell you because you want them to underestimate you. You want them to not appreciate some of the capacity. And there's that fine balance. So I think when some people get really angry at some of the videos that get out there, it's like, well, was that released on purpose? Was that meant to show, oh, look how weak we are, or, oh, we're not as strong as we show we are? And I think that we have to, put that into a little bit of a bubble and appreciate kind of where that sits. Now, it's interesting when you look at what is happening. This is, just to keep in context, we've been talking about Ladakh. We've been talking about India and China and some of the issues that they've had, obviously, with the fight in Ladakh and the other problems in general. The site identified in these charts, in these pictures, lies in the Aksai Chin, which is east of the line of actual control and territory held by China and historically claimed by India. Because remember, when you look at Kashmir, when you look at the Three Forks Dam, not the Three Forks Dam. Wow, not the Three Gorges. Now I'm gonna blank on it, but it'll come to me in a moment. When you look at the water that's coming out into this area, the Indus water, the Indus Valley. So the Indus Water Treaty, which is honored by both Pakistan and India, this is where you're getting into that Ladakh region, which is what we talked about as there's a lot of issues. There still continues to be problems, and China's digging in, and this is but they're doing less on the surface, and they're actually going further underground when you look at different tunnel entrances that have been dug. Now, China appears to be going underground in the Aksai Chin, likely as it looks to offset the advantage the Indian Air Force brings to the playing field. The shift in strategy, unfortunately, also means that they are digging in for the long haul. So you look at, there's reinforced personnel bunkers, there's entry and exits into the region, into the tunnels, into the mountains, and so when you look at India has several helipads, they have several military bases where they could strike at a lot of these areas, but again, there's a certain amount of shifting in terms of where things are. And it's interesting, the one on the top left, you can see area, it wasn't under development in 2021. And then as of 2023, you can see the really massive build out that has happened in that time period. And remember that the Ladakh situation, when we talked about how things were coming to a flashpoint in 2020, and then we talked a lot about it in 21. So we always want to just make sure that everyone knows we're still paying attention. This is not something that has gone away. India and China are still at odds. So when you look at stuff like this, and then you talk about, they became friends with BRICS in Latin America. It's like, well, not really, but let's just keep it all in context when you look at some of these important pieces. Now, I thought this was a good chart. This was supposed to be just about Korea when you're looking at the household debt as a percentage of GDP. And I think it's important when you look at China is sitting at about 60%. And then when you look at the US is sitting about 78%. So it's interesting because the actual debt levels, as we've talked about with China, aren't as bad until you start layering in the other things that they have in terms of the losses that they experience with the real estate, LGFVs. But there's also not the same amount of credit cards that are used in Asia as there is really in the US. So Korea is one of those interesting side pieces where they don't have as many credit card, but they do. Also, to China, it's similar to China. They invest heavily and are exposed heavily into the real estate market, into the housing market, which also creates its own little bubble. Now, it's interesting the evolution in the economies. When you look at the United States, things have kind of flatlined a bit. When you look at the shift in underlying debt as Korea continues to rise, but it's interesting, and this is where China is important, is because. And for those that have been following us, we said that since 2011, there was a pivot where there was a lot of debt that was pushed onto the consumers, with favored rates, trying to kind of shift some of the pressure from one area to the other. And you can see how that's gone essentially in a 45-degree angle since 2011 and really started to build up. So that's why there's such a problem, is because the amount of debt now is massive, and they didn't really have debt up until that point. So it's something that is a sizable shift, which is important to appreciate. In Japan, which is also a group of net savers, is in a similar boat, and you can see how things have kind of flatlined on both in the Japanese economy and some of the pressures that we see in the Chinese economy, and why we think there still has to be a lot of deleveraging in order to reaccelerate some of that spending. Now, it's interesting when you look at the restrictions on trade have increased over the years, and it's something that we've been talking about. And for those that have been following us, since what we call the Rose Garden lie of 2015, when Xi lied to President Obama, we were saying that accelerated some of the issues that we were going to see on the trading front. And we expected to see more gates put up, more pressure put up. And that has only risen over that time period. So when people look at President Trump and say, "Oh, it's like look at what was done with the trade war," it's like realistically, we were always on the path of a trade war. A lot of the laws that he used, numbers that he used, were actually created under President Obama. So it's interesting when you start looking at in the shock-prone world, and this is another issue that we talked about in the what comes after COVID. There's always going to be a push for isolationism, and that's what really ramped up and made parts of the 1930s much worse. And we're seeing it again. And it's interesting because as that happens, you get more and more pressure points, and we're going to talk more about this in segment 5. Economies must be more resilient individually and collectively. Cooperation is critical, but greater protectionism could lead to fragmentation and even split nations into rival blocs, just as fresh shocks expose the global economy's fragility. And we've already seen that. We've seen a big increase in coups and other things. Like we talked about Gabon. Gabon was a pressure point when you look at the Bongo family. There was a lot of pressure with the Bongo, with his son being appointed or being elected, but the point here is: does the military really want to be in control, or do they want to have him out? France, if it's not the largest, it's the second largest military installation that they have in Africa, is in Gabon. But again, we've been talking about there's going to be more coups, there's going to be more uprisings because inflation is high. You have a lot of anger, and that is creating not only just shifts in the political sphere and coups and shifts in terms of protests, but also in the way people trade and interact with each other. So, but not only is it's also going to create different shocks and separations on a tribal level. Like every region, for the most part, is made up of several tribes that live within a similar border or a unified border, but there's specific ghettos or shifts in terms of what you would align to, and at times that gets more those problems rise in the situation versus diminish. Estimates of the cost of fragmentation vary. Greater international trade restrictions could reduce global economic output by as much as 7% over the long term, or about $7.4 trillion in today's dollars. More deliberate global cooperation clearly is needed. International institutes can play a pivotal role trying to bring this together. But it's interesting because when you look at the way the view is on growth, and this is looking to the right, when you look at the mainstream emerging market potential real GDP growth, you can see it's slowing. And a lot of that is because they rely so much on trade, and productivity has diminished significantly, which is why the benefit, and a lot of this is weighted towards China. You're seeing it's like, well, why am I going to stay here? Why am I not going to pull back a bit? But yet the market and hedge funds are more bullish on the emerging market side. They're more bullish on some of the pieces. But when you look at the underlying backdrop, it's kind of hard to be overly bullish. The downside risks to emerging market growth. When you look at China slowing down, when you look at the emerging market manufacturing, slowing below 50 by such a steep percent, you start to get it's going to weigh on growth. It's going to weigh on how are they going to expand. So they've decoupled from China and they've gotten much stronger versus China. But China is a huge trade partner with a lot of these countries and a lot of these nations, and we don't see China really ramping back up. So we do think that there is way more emerging market pressure yet to come. But when you look at the way stock versus bond ratios continue to go, there remains no fear in the market. This is always it's always important to keep your eye on sentiment. And this is looking at that sentiment here and how the market is really pricing in no recession. So it's just to look at caution, especially when you start looking at the sources of external financing of non-financial corporations in the euro area in the U.S. There's the loan side has started to slow just a bit. Debt securities has picked up. Europe has struggled to reissue and to roll some debt where the U.S. has been a bit more advantageous. But then when you look at IPOs have slowed considerably. So there's still some underlying problems. And the reason why we look at the euro area and the U.S. is because this is where the largest amount of developed nations are. And if they can't get financing, again, that's going to reduce CapEx, that's going to reduce investment, and that'll reverberate through the system and put that additional pressure not only on developed markets, but also developing markets and emerging markets, which is why we think that there's going to be that outsized pain or problem at that emerging level.